Hello and welcome to NIGP's Learning Lab. Today's session is Step to Their Side Often, Help Mold and Promote the Team, hosted by Richard Pennington with special guest Valerie Scott. Richard has over 35 years of experience in public procurement law and leadership in the U.S. Air Force and state government, 7 years of which was in private law practice. He helps in development and facilitation of NIGP's Pathways courses. He is co-author of the third edition of the Legal Aspects of Public Procurement and author of Seeing Excellence, Learning from Great Procurement Teams. Richard, I think we can get this thing started.
Okay, great. Well, welcome everybody. So we're turning the corner today on team disciplines. We want you to be able to take a look at meetings again. I know a lot of you are suffering through lots of meetings right now. Talk about conflict a little bit and why often that's constructive. Give you a little idea of checklists of norms. Talk about stuck teams, maybe a way that great author Lencioni has in terms of an approach to unsticking teams. We'll plan a little, just talk about planning a difficult conversation. One of the harder things I think to do throughout a team's life cycle. And throughout this, we're going to keep an eye on what's happening now. You know, when I wrote the book started it 10 years ago, I finished it 7 years ago, we didn't have coronavirus. I mean, we were just barely starting to use virtual things much at all, to be honest with you. And so the book, like many of them of 10 years ago, are largely in an environment where we had face-to-face meetings. So we'll keep an eye on that part of this in terms of how things may have changed. Delighted to have Valerie join us. I know Valerie, she's up in my neck of the woods in Colorado. I live in Denver, not in a mansion with a balcony overlooking the mountains like my image might appear to be. I'm actually downtown. And I know Valerie from RMGPA affiliation primarily. She is manager of purchasing and contracts in the city of Longmont. We'll have a conversation with Valerie today. She was a graduate of the inaugural NIGP Leaders Edge program, and Valerie is a former president of RMGPA, the Rocky Mountain affiliate of NIGP. So did I get that right, Valerie? And welcome.
You got it. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Let's frame teams a little bit. I learned that there is a difference between teams and other groups. I call them loose groups sometimes. Sometimes those are committees. And they're just different from a team because in a couple of ways. One is other loose groups sometimes are a lot larger. And teams to be, at least when you read the research, they say the optimal time, the size for teams is somewhere between 4 and 7 if you're trying to not get in the way of each other. You're trying to have an efficient kind of team activity. So they're limited in size, they're limited in duration, and usually, and they often have a purpose or an objective or a goal that's very specific in terms of what they're trying to achieve. What would be an example of a team that you deal with in your practice? Anybody
I call my group of employees a team.
Okay, so Theo, you're actually you're a supervisor, right? In your
Correct. Yes.
How about when you reach out? How big is your group? I'm just curious. Your
4
group.
of us total.
Okay, so you're right there. Yeah, I mean, they say optimal 4 to 7, but some people are using, they have smaller groups, and so all of these principles still apply. The other thing is you sometimes reach out to people not in your own organization. There's no supervisory relationships. Anybody have any examples of that?
The board of our local NIGP affiliate.
Yeah, same thing here. Yeah, great. I mean, the other obvious one is evaluation committees. They have a very finite period, an objective, usually limited size. That's a team activity, and so all good examples. So the other thing that sometimes we forget is there are different roles that people play on teams. The contributors. When I'm asked usually now these days to be on a team, it's usually to bring the legal perspective. I happen to have that kind of deep knowledge. Many of you have procurement knowledge you bring to an evaluation team, or some people actually are contributing in governance on NIGP affiliates. Some people are good at just communication. Others are pretty good at speaking, and so there's a role for them to do that. The other contributing role sometimes is just somebody that can do minutes, that's able to capture what a group is talking about effectively. Another one is a collaborator. I'm probably not as strong on that. Some people are really good at just bringing people together and serving that function on the team, and reaching out periodically, checking and see how they're doing, and bringing in others and inviting others. And then finally, believe it or not, there's a role for challengers, somebody who protects against something we call groupthink, which means everybody's locked into a certain way of thinking. Somebody plopped it down on the table, sounds good to everybody, they move on, and nobody ever challenges the thinking. And we often need those kind of roles also. Somebody who's going to be the constructive challenger to sort of build conflict or interject conflict in a good way into the thinking, so that we're really testing assumptions in how people are thinking. So when you put all this together and you try to figure out kind of what the difference is between loose groups, often committees that are in standing committees that don't always have a real clear reason for objecting. They may not have specific objectives, teams do. And often size. I've been involved in large committees where you were mostly just trying not so much to get anything done as to get buy-in, to get people that will support a direction, perhaps overcome resistance of change. Those sometimes can be loose groups, and often they kind of spin off into task forces or work groups in order to actually achieve things because of the size of the groups. And again, teams tend to have a bounded size in order to actually get things done, so they're efficient. They're usually finite duration. I know in Leader's Edge, I'm part of the Leadership Development Committee. I've been on it 2 years. We have it's standing committee. So we pick out periodically things that we need to do. Often we'll do a small work group to do that, but we don't have finite duration. We're actually working long term on a committee. And a lot, I think the NIGP and even some of the local affiliate governance bodies like executive boards and those things are standing and don't necessarily have a finite duration. And that matters. We'll hit a few of those things in a little bit. And then finally, succession. I think it's hard on an NIGP committee when people rotate out every year towards the end, or even in groups like our chapters. We have an annual rotation often, whereas teams, to be effective, ideally have a certain amount of continuity. They may have to reset as membership changes, but they're usually characterized more by continuity. What are the personal objectives of team members? What do you think?
I think it's to work together to achieve the goal, and also to support each other, to learn from each other as well. I think that's
good.
Good objective for the team.
Anybody else want to build on that? I'm just curious.
I think to gain knowledge from each other.
Great answer.
Kind of goes right along with Doris's thoughts.
You've got experience with this. I mean, it's hard to come in and say, I'm going to teach you teaming, because we've all got experience with this, and you just illustrated some important parts of it. Often, this is the way it's defined. You try to be part of a bonded group. You got a real purpose that matters, and really it can only be done by collective action. You can't do it individually. Has anybody heard of the Tuckman model? Forming, storming, norming? I think it was back in the late 60s, actually. His name is Bruce Tuckman, that came up with a model for team development. And what he found was that there's a life cycle. And at the beginning stage, when teams are formed, there's often an amount of uncertainty. People may not know each other. They're a little bit uncertain about what exactly their role is. There may be a little bit of anxiety about whether they even fit in. And that's kind of the forming stage when you're putting the people together. And ideally, if somebody who's the initial leader is trying to come up with a size that makes sense, that has the different roles like contributors and those people that can sort through this. But for the members that are joining the team, there's often anxiety. And the next phase that they found was what they call storming. And that means where all of a sudden, people, once they at least know each other, they start figuring out and try to where they're going to fit, maybe their own sense of the direction. And there's a little bit of uncertainty about the direction the team's going to go and how they're going to get there. And often it's a little bit disorganized. And they call that kind of the storming phase. And eventually a team moves into what they call the norming kind of phase. There aren't these large signs that say no, we're now in this phase. It just kind of happens. And at this stage, the team is starting to figure out its way of working together. And we're going to talk about kind of what those norms sort of look like. I was out of the military, so to me, timeliness is a big issue, and it's something I got to get over sometimes. But just starting on time, being on time, I always thought was a sign of respect for people, and so that's kind of a norm that teams have to develop how they're going to approach that. Eventually, though, you move into the performing stage of a project, and that's when the work's getting done, and you've come up with strategies for how you're going to achieve it, a little bit of structure for how you're going to do follow-ups, and trying to get to a deliverable or something that the team's going to achieve. Those were the four that he first came up with. Later, they added a fifth stage that's called adjourning, which means what happens at the end, like things like celebration and when the team actually dissolves, or the other thing is learning. After action reviews, if you've ever heard of those, at some point the team needs to look back, think of what worked, what they thought was going to happen that didn't, what the reasons are. That's kind of an adjourning phase. Well, the interesting thing about the research on this is that there's been a finding that teams often will have a period in which they really decrease their efficiency, and there's a decrease of performance often initially. And then as they start to move forward into the norming and the performing and the adjourning phases, they at that point they start getting more efficient, they get successful outcomes, and they start working together really more cohesively. They develop the trust and they are able to achieve. But there often is a dip in performance early on. What I'd like to just ask is, have any of you been involved on a team anywhere, on a church team, a chapter governance team, evaluation team, anything that we'd characterize as a team that's trying to actually achieve an outcome, and seen an example of this gap in performance?
Yes, I'm the treasurer of what used to be a local ISM chapter.
Yeah.
We are no longer affiliated with ISM, but we still are trying to offer education to the same people. So that, we have a team there. I've been the treasurer of that, on that board for many years.
Did you see times, Thea, when you reconstituted teams or you had new members come in, or something like that, where you actually saw dips in performance?
Yeah, I mean, it's been the same, of course, the same team of people for very many years, because you can't get volunteers anymore, it doesn't seem like. But, yeah, I think, I think now that we are, we've no longer affiliated with ISM, and so we're trying to rebuild. We're kind of seeing that now. Yeah, definitely.
And I mean, how did you come out of that? I mean, what kinds of things did you see people actually do that would start to move it in the direction of being more effective as a team? Just curious.
Well, I think, once we were able to kind of prove ourselves, one, to our membership, that we were still going to be able to offer them good educational information, and then we started seeing more membership participation, which kind of helped the board.
We're talking about this dip in performance that actually happens early on in teams. And the question is, have you ever encountered it? And the second is kind of, why did it happen and what did you sort of do to overcome it? So Thea was sharing that before the internet gremlins got a hold of her. So others that have seen this.
We are, in a way going through this cycle because our team is forming and we've got, like myself, I'm a new person, fairly new to the organization, and there's people leaving. And so we're kind of in the midst of the, I think we would be in between the forming and the storming phase, but there's a touch of the norming as well. So I like this model and I see it, but I think there's also, there's parts where I mentioned where it's kind of integrated. You're not in only one or the other.
Yeah.
There's a
And that's the
combination.
criticism, Doris, that's the criticism Richard Hackman, who's a professor out of Harvard that likes life cycles, thought that it's not quite as cut and dry as this. There are, and often you'll start moving up in terms of your performance efficiency, and then you'll find out you need to kind of go back because there's been something that happens. Like we can't get together anymore in person. We're all working from home. So great observation. If doesn't seem this cut and dry, it really isn't. So any other thoughts on this issue, the kind of these different phases, the sometimes decrease in performance efficiency and then of a team, and then how you worked out of it? Any other thoughts?
We're about to enter a storming here where I am. Our unit was dismantled, strategic sourcing unit was dismantled. We're amalgamated with the procurement operation department, which is great. And actually tomorrow we have our first planning session on how to rebuild this team and new roles and responsibilities. So we had a little bit of an explosion, and so now we're getting back into it.
And and that's a great example. Sometimes just team membership changes even cause you to retreat a little, and we see this in committee work. I think at NIGP, we sometimes when you'll get a series of new committee members, they are sort of in the storming phase when the rest of you all been working and you together, and so you sometimes have to go back and use some of the approaches to just get them caught up. And that could be even a team mentorings thing where you assign somebody to go talk with them. We, if you ever look at the NIGP volunteer video, Leadership Development Committee did that. And if you're ever a NIGP volunteer, you'll probably be asked to review it. Those ideas came from this too. It's a similar sort of concept. So great observation, Stephanie. In 2008, the state of Oregon had some unprecedented flooding, and they declared an emergency. The governor did. The procurement office went to the Emergency Operations Center, and they did what they needed to do in terms of managing the flooding that was pretty widespread in Oregon. And at the end of it, there was a woman named Marcy Stone who was working in the procurement office, and she got with some of the people that she had worked with, and they talked about the response and what they had done, and they said, this worked out okay, what we did, but in terms of our various roles, we think that there's some improvements that can be made. So what they decided to do was convene a group, a team, and work on disaster preparedness. Now, the caution I got here is they were talking about disasters as we used to know them, which means how do you plan for mobilization and disaster response when what your issue is you may have places that you can't go to because there's been flooding, hurricanes, and the rest of that. This was kind of before the pandemic era. But to their credit, when we talked to or when I talked to Marcy, when they got together and brainstormed as one of the initial phases of the team development, they realized that they needed to have some people that didn't necessarily come to the Emergency Operations Center in a flood. And what were those? Well, one of those was the Department of Public Health. And so they brought in and invited other team members to help them with the planning that they were going to do. They stormed for a bit. One of the problems that they had was initially they got off track because everybody was so enthusiastic about it. And they started talking about all of the problems that they had seen, like they couldn't get internet connection in various parts of the state. Somebody needed to develop a map that showed where the hotspots were and the good internet connections, where the dead zones were on cell. And they started down that road, and then somebody went, time out. What are we trying to do? I mean, so there was, I wouldn't say they had any anger or emotion, which you sometimes have in early team exercises. But what Marcy did was she used a common training technique called a parking lot. And as they got into these great ideas, they said, well, let's first build a charter. What are we trying to achieve? And what they were trying to achieve was the development of procurement tools that were intuitive, that could be used by people that might not be necessarily experts in emergency responses. And they took the other ideas, like where are the mobile hotspots and the dead zones, and can we map those so if we have to deploy to locations we know where our communications need to be set up. They put those on the parking lot, and they up-channeled it to the statewide emergency planning committee, so they could stay focused on the really on the procurement aspects of this. They eventually came up with norms. They did develop a project charter. They put the purpose, which was the development of procurement tools, on the charter. They discussed as a team, what does it mean to be committed to this team, and what are our expectations in terms of attendance, and what if you can't make it, what are you expected to do? Like simple courtesy emails to the team lead. They, as they worked through performing and they started doing the process mapping, they did a few things. One is they shared leadership. They didn't just have Marcy doing the meetings, they shared the leadership of the meetings. And I think they were meeting about every 2 or 3 weeks initially, and then eventually went a little bit less frequency. But they mapped processes. They used non-experts, like people from the benefits section of HR, to sit at the table on a tabletop exercise and use their draft guides. And they'd ask them to work through a tabletop exercise on a disaster to see if they understood them. Brought in people that weren't necessarily procurement experts, because why? Sometimes people have to deploy that aren't even in a procurement office and need to do some of the early response. They went back to the charter often. They kept the purpose at the bottom of the agenda, so that if they ever got off track, somebody could say, hey, let's look at the agenda that's on the purpose on the agenda. Are we off track? And it was really quite a success. If you ever look at the Oregon site on disaster preparedness, they're in subsequent iterations of this, but it's really a well thought out website with tools. It was so good, they got national recognition. They got they won the NASPO, the National Association of State Procurement Officials Award, called the Cronin Award, for procurement excellence, for the development of a disaster preparedness kit that included a armband with thumb drives on it, so that when they went with battery operated sort of computers and manual purchase orders, if they ever needed to go in and start buying stuff on site to help people, they had that, along with a Yellow Pages book to find possible vendors, and PPE. They didn't know at the time that was going to be something that we needed for coronavirus, but they had that in that work group, and that's been several years ago that they developed that. So that was, I like to tell the story. It's in chapter, a couple places actually in the book, if you look up the Oregon pieces of this. What Marcy really illustrated is something that is known as facilitative leadership, and you're going to see a lot of this not only in the book that I wrote, but especially some of the current thinking on leadership of teams and even larger organizations. And I've got on here a few of the types of behaviors that really are key to facilitating leadership of teams so you get involvement and broad engagement, like the use of questions and just the importance of listening, trying to find out ways to draw out teammate contributions in constructive ways, using techniques like mirroring and paraphrasing and summarizing what somebody has said, and basically providing a positive reinforcement. And what I don't do well is not always filling in silence too quickly. Sometimes you've just got to let the thoughts incubate in people's minds, especially I think in this environment when you can't look around a room necessarily. And when I look around the room, I just see names. I don't see eyes rolling in the back of their head. I don't see fidgeting. I don't see what other people are doing. And there's a reluctance. I mean, it's a discomfort for me when I don't really hear anything going on. I'm just curious. Anybody share that that concern?
I struggle with that. I need to see body language and
Yeah.
eye contact with people. That's been difficult in the virtual world.
Yeah. How about stepping on people? Do you see that problem in teams that you're part of, stepping on people, stepping on them figuratively?
Right. Yeah, sometimes it's hard to have a conversation because you don't, you think you're interrupting somebody or you are, and then going back and forth, it's just very difficult that way.
And sometimes that's the internet lag. I mean, sometimes you don't know if you're done or the other people don't know when you're done, and that's difficult. Yeah.
It helps when the video is on because you can see when somebody wants to speak or is, moving or, but I agree with you, Richard. I do also lots of facilitation, and it's hard because I feed on the energy from the room, and I
Yeah.
find that it's very difficult to not get that energy. So
Yeah, and so everybody has recognized the difficulty of not having body language, and yet nobody's got their. Let's see who does. I think Doris does. She's got
just
hers
came
on.
on.
So look at you. Yeah. Okay.
I've been walking.
So
I've been
yeah.
walking back and forth. I'm sorry, my internet's very unstable, and it was
No, that's okay. And I love that excuse. The internet. I love that. So you can always blame the internet, right? So the other thing I've seen people do is I like to call it the Bernie. They may not know how to raise their hand on the participant window, but they know how to do this. So sometimes you just use a Bernie and get people to talk about that. So cool.
I have to use my phone because it's Zoom, so I have to put it down. I can't hold it the whole time. So you look at my ceiling.
Oh, you're doing this on a phone? You're doing this on a phone?
Yeah, because I can't have Zoom on my work computer. It's not allowed.
Interesting.
So I logged on my the safety issues of cyber security. Anyway, so that's why my camera's off, because normally I always have it on.
Okay. Okay, great. So I mentioned Richard Hackman, and I just wanted to talk about, he kind of sees things instead of forming, storming, norming, performing as the beginning and the midpoint and the end. And I thought when I first saw what he was writing, he was talking about consultant help. And really what he's talking about is somebody fulfilling the role at various times in a team's life for things like, and it can be the leader. I mean, it can be the actual designated leader, but it can be other people that have these skills to help out. Like in the beginning, it's often a motivational thing, just trying to get people to, hey, hang in there. We're going to get this done. Hang in there. Please come. We want your contributions. This is important. Motivational kind of focusing. And at the midpoint, usually, once you get those norms and you start working, it's more like consulting, really. It's a coaching behavior often that is facilitative. The people step back, let the performing happen. You kind of just reflect on what you're doing in terms of task performance, what are your strategies kind of for doing the work, and we'll mention a couple of those in a little bit. And then finally at the end, often the coaching is just getting people to say, should we just have a after action review or whatever you call it, so we can just reflect on what we did and what we learned from it, because we may work together again. I should look back and, and the questions are, what did we think was going to happen? What actually
Right.
happened? What was the reasons for the difference, and kind of what do we learn, going forward? And, it's particularly important in committees, standing committees. Do you ever go on a NIGP or a committee, or maybe even a chapter committee, and say, hey, let's just spend 10 minutes and talk about what just happened today? I mean, did people feel like it was a productive use of time? How could we have made the agenda better? That sort of thing. And just to take some time to coach. I mean, and you can do that as a lateral leader. I mean, if you can bring it up and say, hey, before we leave, I just have a need to reflect on what we did today. And that's something that you can do without being the actual leader of the team. So.
Yeah, we did something similar to that on a much smaller scale, but it was helpful and effective when I was leading a meeting with another department, going over their contracts. And at the end of the meeting, we asked for, because it was something new that we were doing or starting on a monthly basis. And so we asked for feedback on, what they thought about the spreadsheet that was used and just on the format, et cetera. And so we got a few productive feedback. And so we applied those. So it's, it's better. So it's a much smaller scale, but, it's the same concept.
Yeah. And I think, on evaluation committees, I debrief at the end, maybe after the protests are all gone, right? So, and you can say, here's what let's talk about what worked and what didn't on evaluation committees. I mean, especially when you're often using many of the same ones again, they'll be reconstituted. I think it's important. So great insight, Doris. Thanks. Valerie and I have known each other for some time. She's also recently in a new leadership position. That was January, right? Valerie, I think. Yeah. And so we're going to learn from you. And just so everybody understands, what is the size of yours is a division. That's the way you characterize your organizational level, right? Is that, yeah.
That's correct.
Yeah. Yeah.
So in our purchasing and contracts division, we have 6.5 FTEs. So really it's 7 people in total.
Yeah. Okay. And that's right on the outer limit of what the research says is a good sized team. So you're sort of moving from, I know you've been working on teams because you're in procurement your whole time. Now you're in a different role as probably the recognized team leader often on the things that you do, but you're also moving into another team, the executive team, in terms of management. So that's been a change that I'm pretty sure you're feeling pretty challenged by, right? Is that fair?
I think that's a wonderful way to characterize it. Yeah.
Okay, challenge. So I use the term facilitative leadership. So what have you learned, Valerie, about the kind of the effect of language, the importance in teams? Just curious.
I think with language, it's really important to kind of step out of my own head, like put myself in the other person's shoes and think about if someone were coming to me, what kind of language is the kind of language that's going to get my attention? What's going to make me want to do my best? What's going to bring out my best behaviors? So there's a book out there called Tribal Leadership. And one of the cornerstones in the book is talking about how the language a team uses can tell you a lot about where the team is in terms of how they perform. So it talks about when people are using everything is terrible language versus everything in my life is terrible language versus I'm really great language versus, hey, we're really great. And then all the way up to at the upper end, at least in the book at the time it was published, was looking more globally at what's the global good. So when people talk in terms of, negative to positive and from me focus to global focus, what that can tell you about where the team's performance is and, how much you're going to get done and what the culture in your team is.
When I set the title for chapter 4 and the Creating Excellence, Step to Their Side Often, that was because I thought that was probably one of the key things on effective team lateral leadership was getting understanding that. I mean, the other word is empathy. And I think in terms of the importance of that, I thought it was interesting when you and I spoke about this session, we shared experiences with vulnerability and showing vulnerability. Share that with us. What was what did you learn about yourself on that?
Yeah, that was an interesting one for me. So, part of the Leaders Edge program, one of the first things we did was to take the EQI, which is the emotional intelligence assessment. And I always thought that, the more I kept my personal life and my work life separate and drew a firm line in the sand and never showed a crack, that meant I was being a good business person. And after I took that assessment, the interesting thing was that, there's more of a balancing point to that. And there's a point at which you don't show any kind of vulnerability to the people who you're working around, to the point that it almost inhibits trust and building trusting working relationships, because if people view you as a robot who has no emotions and never buckles under pressure or never has any troubles in the world, they're less likely to reach out to you when they need help. So I've employed this new approach of, appropriate level of vulnerability in the workplace, and being able to share a little bit more in order to build some trust.
Yeah, great insight. And I know in the current Leaders Edge class I was on, I forgot which, I think that was the first one, maybe the first class. I did point out that you've got to be a little bit realistic also about the environment in which you're in, because there are some white men that are my age often grew up in a competitive environment where displaying vulnerability isn't necessarily seen as a strength. And so I was just trying to, and I think people were taken back by it a little, just realize that there's a real politic part of all of this too, especially as a woman, I think, moves up into executive kind of male dominated environments. You have to be a little bit sensitive, I think, to that. But I believe you've got a great environment where you work. I mean, from what I understand about the city of Longmont, you've got people that maybe haven't all been to the Leaders Edge program, but they think that way, right?
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
there's a very collaborative, a good culture from the top down, from city manager and on.
Cool. The I'm going to just resume share. Leaders Edge introduced a concept, a book, a man, Daniel Coyle was his name, and I'll share the screen now. I don't know how many of the rest of them have heard of this, but I'm going to just put up this graphic, which I think is a good one. You actually pulled this out from your Leaders Edge experience when we were talking about something that was meaningful to you. How has that been relevant to your leadership and your team, that model that he has?
I think it provides a really good roadmap of, building a successful organizational culture. So, first people need to know they're safe. They need to know that it's that there's trust there. You have to build trust and belonging. And when they feel connected, it's easier to share vulnerability and to share risk. And, it continues to build on from there. And it's easier to develop that shared idea of this is our purpose, and to have shared goals and values, and just keep the team moving forward in a way where it's not just me saying this is what we're going to do, but something everyone actually buys into and believes in.
She and Valerie got me to be a believer on this, and so I went and looked on YouTube. If you look up Daniel Coyle Culture Code, there's a great series of videos on YouTube on him, and he's of the opinion that culture really is that we've thought about this wrong for a long time, that this is probably one of the key aspects of a successful teams. And it really comes down, I think, what you have alluded to, and that is the trust really on this. So great. The other one, and I hadn't actually I might have heard about this next one at some point. You kind of showed it to me, and then I discovered this when I was doing some reading on mentoring. You know, we got a mentoring group now on Facebook through NIGP, and some of the writing on this. One of the women that writes so well on mentorship has the Johari window. So this was one that struck you, obviously, because you brought it up when you and I talked. Tell me about what this means to you.
Yeah, so this Johari window really was written with coaching in mind, but I found that it has, just as much of an importance and impact when you're talking about building relationships with teams, within the team, outside of the team. And it kind of goes through, what does it look like when both people know all of the information? And then, if you go diagonally down to where no one knows all of the information, and it looks at these different, just different things that need to be considered. And I think it really comes into communication as well. When you're trying to communicate with someone who doesn't know what you know, or if they know what you don't know. So it's kind of walking through these cycles of understanding that and being prepared to address it when it comes up.
I mean, what you're trying to do is operate in the upper left, right?
Right.
The open area. I mean, isn't that what you're trying to achieve? And then realize that there are going to be blind spots, and you're trying to probe for that. Like asking something like, I just feel like you have a feeling about this, this session that I may not be aware of. Help me understand. That's the I don't know. And then the question is, are you putting on facades? I think I love the window in terms of the window into relationships. I think that's a great tool. Johari window. And actually, if you all want to learn about it, if you Google it, there's lots of stuff on Johari windows that I think is very good. So when I mentioned in chapter 4, and then we'll talk a little bit more, we have a lot on meetings, and there's and meetings obviously are central to teams, especially now. I just think the whole character of meetings is different. I call teams the lifeblood of organizations. I think meetings often are the lifeblood of teams. And when I had written, as I mentioned, it was all in a physical environment. Now all that's changed. To you, Valerie, how have behaviors on effective meetings changed now since, let's say, February, when all this started? Just curious.
It's been interesting in a few ways. I'm very much an agenda-oriented person, and when I go into a meeting, I want to know exactly what we're going to cover so I can be prepared. We can get to the point and we can get out. An interesting dynamic I've found, and talking with other managers, I know they found this too, is that people are so isolated right now that it's almost hard to do that because they just want to see a face and talk a little bit. And so, there's this kind of, yes, we want to get to the point, we want to get work done, we want to keep moving forward, but there also is this other kind of element of compassion and understanding that people have a lot going on right now. So that's been one thing. Another thing is, I've been on calls with other groups within the city where there's a bunch of managers and everyone wants to talk all the time. And there have kind of been some norms established of, hey, we're all going to be on mute. And when you want to say something, virtually raise your hand and someone will call on you. And it's helped with that, lag of the internet and talking over one another. But it's been interesting just to observe, when I maybe just want to move through something, there are times where, okay, this person clearly just needs like another human to talk to for a minute, and trying to have a little compassion and yet keep it in a reasonable,
And, yeah. And what I've had to learn is to look at the participant window so I can see when there's a raised hand, like Stephanie just did. So Stephanie, either your arm is tired because it was raised and you forgot to put it down, or you have a question for us. So
I just wanted to make a parallel that the slide before as well, Richard, because we worked on the relationship and the importance of relationships. And I think some of the concepts there also apply not just to teams, but could apply to relationship development in our role, that safety, the vulnerability, and all that. So that's all I thought this, because of the new best practice. So
Yeah, great comment. Actually, and when you think about it, a team development isn't very far from relationship development on one-on-one.
Yeah.
I mean, they're
I guess it's just a
Yeah.
team of two.
yeah, in
So,
many ways
yeah.
it is. Yeah. So great,
Yeah.
great comment. Seeing excellence when you get into, it's a book about team disciplines, and it goes beyond just the dynamics of team development. It goes on to other things like project management and the rest of that. But one thing that I thought was important was to focus a chapter on leadership in a small group setting. And the title of it, which is Lead Laterally, Choose to Help, was a concept called lateral leadership that I discovered probably 8 or 10 years ago. Is that something, Valerie, that you value in teams, that you're obviously a formal leader of this team. Have you seen members laterally lead in your group in terms of trying to promote more innovative solutions, something like that? Just curious.
I have, and it's something I really value because I feel like even the manager prior to me, before she retired, she was really good about, and the manager before her too, to be honest, just very good about seeing opportunities for people who aren't necessarily the leader, if you will, of the group, having an opportunity to make an impact and to grow their own skill set and to lead in various ways. So, one thing I try really hard to do, and I think it maybe has to do with being a new manager, and on top of being a new manager, having a couple new senior level procurement folks in our office that people just haven't had a chance to get to know yet because we've all been working from computers since they've been hired. But to not, feed into the solving everyone's problems. So I've seen more so than I think has been historical for our organization. When people aren't happy with what their person has told them, they're coming to me and saying, hey, can you just do something on this? Can you just make the call? And so there's this balance of, well, I don't want it to sound like I don't have the authority to make the call, but it's also being super careful to make sure that they understand I fully trust the people that have been assigned to work with them as professionals who, know what they're doing. So when that happens, I say, oh, hey, I've heard you. I appreciate your feedback. Let me get the other side of it from our end, and then we will be back in touch with you. And another interesting thing that came from that, I used to say, let me check with. And it came back to me that was starting to read as, oh, she can't make decisions. She has to ask permission from her staff. And so that kind of threw me off. I was surprised. It's just something I say, let me check with such and such, because that's what makes sense to me. So I'm learning still to be really intentional about the way I say things and the words I use, because it's more of I trying to show that I respect and trust the expertise of my staff, and I need to fully understand what's going on here because they are fully capable of making that decision without my intervention.
Wait, that last example you just gave is sort of related to the be aware of the context in which you lead, because sometimes vulnerability is not really valued. The other thing is collaboration sometimes is not really valued by some people that you may have in an organization. So you got a little taste of that. I mean, there are people that are raised in a competitive environment that think that you should know it all, and that the fact that you would say, I'm going to go check with somebody, which I believe is a great approach, isn't appreciated all the time by everybody that's above you. I mean, it's something you've got to be sensitive to. Any questions for Valerie? Did she say anything that reaffirmed your outlook or prompted you to reflect on an experience you'd had. Any questions for Valerie?
The discussion earlier about the language, you know, how you use language in front of certain people, how you phrase things. That's something that I constantly have to think about.
That's great. Great, great, Doris. Anybody, did that prompt any thoughts by anybody? What Doris just said, which is a problem I have too, to be honest with you. So.
Yeah, I think the language is a huge thing. I've been accused by my team employees that I'm a little bit too harsh when I communicate via verbally as well as through emails.
Yeah.
So I have to be very careful about how I communicate with them to make sure that I'm not talking at them, or not talking to them, but at them or with them, kind of keep them involved as part of the team rather than me just, giving orders. So I've tried working very hard about when I word my emails to them or we have meetings and I communicate with them that it's not all, do, but try and get their buy-in, ask for their opinions, their ideas, their thoughts, and really listen to what they're saying to me. And if they've got a thought or an idea that's better than maybe what I'm thinking, that we implement that or we go that route so that they feel a part of the team and not just me pushing all my, do's down their throat.
Yeah, great comments. Sometimes I use humor. I tend to be a challenger, and sometimes now you can say there's studies that say that a challenger needs to be part of a team to make it effective. I'm going to be the challenger, and most people start laughing because they know I'm going to do that. So and that's actually the value of norms, to be honest with you. If you've got something you can point to talk, so you don't make it personal on people, it's a way to get back to having that discussion. Great conversation. We're moving now a little bit into the idea of structure in teams, and sometimes can there be too much? And I'm going to just have you reflect on some things here as we talk about a few of these things. In fact, next month's session on project management, or my take on project management, is titled "Use Just Enough Structure." Not too much, just enough structure, and to organize thinking and action. And so we're going to talk about that. I've got a little story that's in chapter 4, a book I like to tell, and Valerie's going to know this one. In fact, you might have gone to these meetings. I don't know. They were started by a woman named Terry Brustad from the city of Arvada, and she was the procurement card administrator. And she started having it and was having problems with adoption and frustrations with people following the rules, and sent out an email to some of her colleagues about, does anybody feel a need to get together and talk about this? And she got a pretty good response. I think she told me she got about 25 or 30 back right away. And she decided to set a group, and she enlisted the help of another colleague, a woman named Carol Wills, down at the Academy School District in Colorado Springs. They didn't have a charter. They didn't have bylaws. It was just them. But they got people together in a room. And this is an actual photo I took of one of the meetings at the procurement card working group. And they just wanted to talk about what some of the challenges were and what people were overcoming in the implementation. They shared leadership. And so I think it was Carol and Terry with actually figuring out to put a room together this way so that people could talk to one another instead of the customary way that we do auditorium seating. But they got people to come in and share their perspectives on things. She had a conversation with it, and to their credit, when they ended up with entities from all over Colorado, even some Indian tribes that were part of this. I had to laugh. I think it was 2012 when I saw the last emails kind of come out on this. She's since gone to the National Association of Procurement card people, and she's left government and is doing that now, I'm sure successfully. But one of the last things I did was I sent out an email to all of her colleagues and said, we've been doing this quarterly. How about if we slip this now to 3 times a year, once every 4 months? And she actually got pushback on that because they were enjoying being together and talking about these things so much. The reason I put this here is it was a different kind of, a group. It was an effective group. It didn't use a lot of structure. It had a kind of a standing purpose. She built small little targeted objectives each time they got together and got a lot of buy-in from that. But she didn't have a whole bunch of structure that kind of burdened things down that people would be tired of. That's sometimes what I guess causes people in many governance positions to get a little bit tired because they don't feel like the return on the investment of time in terms of the bureaucracy is really worth what they're doing. So it's a difficult balance, I think, to do that. Structure is one of the norms. They're the kinds of things that you can talk about in the norming phase fairly early on about how we're going to work as a group. I mean, are we going to use emails? Thea raised a good question. Are we going to use emails to communicate? Or are we going to get together with Zoom? How often are we going to get together? Who is going to make what decisions? Do we need to have a multi-vote every time we do a meeting set? Or can we just do that? How are we going to do it? What are the attendance expectations? If you can't be there, what's expected? Who's going to lead meetings? It's really recommended that you try to share meetings and also share work. One of the problems you're trying to achieve or challenges is to get at least a rough economic equivalence in people's contributions to teamwork. And people know that the leader that is a manager often has other things, but you need to at least show up and try to provide support and contribute that way. And what are the virtual differences? This slide didn't have that on it a couple 3 years ago, but what are the virtual differences in terms of how we're going to operate as a team? These are some of the examples of some of the norms. Anybody think of other ones that you talk about or you fall into? Sometimes these aren't even written down. I made it a practice when I joined a team and said, I don't know if we're going to have a meeting about this, but let me tell you something about the way I like to operate. I sure like people to be on time. I'll just do an email and share it and invite others to do an email string. And sometimes you can do it that way. And then somebody can put that together in a consolidated sort of email saying, I think this is what I heard everybody saying, sounds good to us. And then you've got norms sort of established. And I mentioned it before, sometimes if it's written down, and this could be in a charter too, if you're big enough to do a charter. Sometimes if it's written down, it's easier to go back when you're having problems and revisit something by saying, here's kind of what we agreed on. I'm sensing some problems with some of this and, just to raise it. So just some ideas. Thoughts, anybody?
I was just going to add confidentiality. So I'm on an employee advisory group.
Yeah.
We shared some very, very personal things across the group, and we had to have a discussion about, okay, what is confidential? City manager's on this call. What should you not say if it should be confidential and you don't want him to have to do something? So establishing norms about, what those types of boundaries might be.
That's a great idea. We're doing that mentor thing in December on the mentoring group, and that's going to be the one norm that we're going to have is confidentiality. Now, I would say that one of the ways to back into that on a norm is to say, should we have pre-meeting meetings, and on things that are particularly sensitive and confidential, we'll leave it up to Valerie or whoever to say, you know what, this is one, let Valerie know this is one we may want to have 15 minutes probably not 15 minutes before the Zoom starts, because that's when everybody's joining. But great insight, Valerie. Other thoughts on the norms? I'm thinking I might just add that to this sometime, Valerie. I'll steal your idea. So that was good. So other ideas on norms?
Richard, this is Shannon. I was going to say, expectations about project management style,
Yeah, yeah.
how you
I-
organize your thoughts for a meeting, if you send an agenda or you don't, and having those things that one department or one person within a department does and others don't, leave something to be desired when they're missing from others.
That's a great idea. You know, Shannon, you snuck in here and I don't have my participant screen. So if you don't mind just letting people know who you are. Those of us that have been involved on forum and virtual conferences know who you are, but you can just introduce yourself.
Sure. Sorry. We are actually running a virtual conference live right now for SCAGCO and IAPO. So that's why I've been sort of popping out.
Yeah.
My name is Shannon Lockwood. I'm the Events and Programs Manager for NIGP. And as Richard said, I am all things virtual conferences and forum for the NIGP events team. So my project management answer relates directly to my own personal experience with this is how I like information organized. That leads me to another thought is file sharing. You say sharing work here, but I'm thinking about like the organizational system that an organization uses is definitely up in the air in most places I've ever worked.
Great. Yeah. Great idea. Yeah. Yeah. Are you using Dropbox? What are the expectations? Who are you going to send it to so they can load it up?
Yep.
That's important. Yeah. Great idea.
Thanks.
You're insanely organized, Shannon. I'm impressed with what you do on that.
To the chagrin of many, I'm sure.
Yeah, you're a contributor. You're one of the roles, so you're doing all that stuff. So cool.
Thank you.
And Richard, in the chat, Thea says she has an agenda and provides it before the meeting.
Yeah, and we've got a slide on meetings. We're not going to go too much into meetings, but we're going to hit that a little bit because I think that is important. I mean, it is the lifeblood of what teams do, especially now. I mean, how you're doing meetings. So hold that thought, Thea. That's a great idea. A little bit on performance strat.
Oh, sorry.
So,
I made this new norm for Teams meetings.
okay, there you go. So,
Have a little bit of fun sometimes because it's difficult sometimes, right? So try to have one appropriate.
Yeah.
Try to loosen up a little bit.
And in the handout I gave you, I've got quite a bit on meetings in the book. I didn't have anything much on virtual meetings in the book, and so I've given you in the handout we distributed some ideas on that. And I've seen Stephanie work on meetings, just having icebreakers and a little bit of humor and a way to kind of ease into this stuff is important too, and come up with something that you're comfortable with. So
you'll be surprised what people will do. You just needs one to get it started, and then it takes off like dominoes.
Yeah,
so
that's
anyway,
right.
be creative. Don't be shy if it's appropriate.
Well, when we started using class photos on training to encourage people to turn on their videos, that even helped. I mean, it was funny just doing things like that to have a little fun. A little bit on performance strategies, things, and you might call these norms, whatever. I think I've seen these listed as strategies, but one is consolidated replies on e-communications. Sometimes there's so many emails going around that it's nice to have somebody designated. Can you capture all of that in one document so we can, this happens on Insight too. We get all these great things and then good luck going to try to find anything on a committee meeting or the rest of that. And but it's called a consolidated reply where you sort of capture the thoughts and post it once. Individual versus work group tasks. Committees are kind of notorious for this. It's hard to get things done unless you carve out at least somebody, hopefully not one person, hopefully some people that you're using on work groups to do the heavy lifting. Sometimes it can be just one person, but I think that's important too. And that's a strategy in terms of how you move along teams. And then interlocking teams. We're doing that now with the mentoring and the leadership development committee. We've got kind of work groups, it looks like we're going to have that are targeted on some specific deliverables, and they're going to figure out a way to get together and trade notes. Probably in procurement offices now, they're doing that as they allocate or dedicate some purchasing agents to certain departments, other purchasing agents to others. You'll often have interlocking issues on teams that you need to just get teams together periodically to trade notes on. So those are all kind of performance strategies that go along with norms. There are different purposes for meetings. Some are just informational. I know there are some groups now that do almost what we call a stand-up for checking in during coronavirus, where they're just trying to keep up with what everybody's doing. And they can be 15, 20 minutes. Everybody shows up, says what they've got to say, move on. Those are informational. When you're putting question marks on agendas and you're inviting people to contribute, your mind expanding, those are really idea creation meetings. And you need to figure out, I think, what your meeting objective is, or what portion of a meeting that's going to be. Should you share agendas and leadership? I think you should. And if not the whole one, go to somebody like Valerie and say, Valerie, we're having a 2-hour meeting. It's on Learning Lab. I'd sure like you to be a part of this. Go to people and get somebody else to share the leadership of agendas and topics and try to build that in. Do you do that?
Yes, always. My meetings always have an agenda, always have a, hey, I'm planning to call on you to do this type communication in advance, and always try to make sure that if I'm going to call on people, or if I ask, for ideas, especially within those idea creation conversations, giving folks time to think about it. I have lots of folks around me who need time to digest and think about something. They can't just off the cuff have a robust conversation. And so it's frustrating for me as someone who wants to just talk off the cuff and figure it out and have somebody say, yeah, that's a good idea, bad idea. So in order to get my objective completed, I always send something and say, my expectation is that you guys will come with X, Y, and Z, whether it's a naming convention for a new product or topic areas for a new conference, et cetera.
We just started doing that with our team meetings. Every month, one of the team members is assigned to bring an educational topic for the team.
Yeah.
So that it's just not me talking every single month. So
yeah.
Our first month was November, and it worked out really well. And they all seem to be very excited about it. So I think it's going to be a good thing.
What is it, all work-related educational topics, or is it open? I'm just curious.
I left it open. I would like for it to be somehow related to our jobs or leadership, or that kind, some sort of something that would be of interest and of use. Yeah, or if it could be motivational, if they find something or have read something motivational that they'd want to share.
Thank you.
Great. The bullet I've got here, now you've probably heard this before. It's awful hard to be the note taker and facilitate a conversation. It's nice to try to reach out to somebody, see if you can find somebody to maybe record minutes if you're using minutes as a strategy. We've already mentioned icebreakers, check-ins. One of the bad things now that we're all to the second on time is everybody waits to right on the hour to join. I always like that time, right? The 5 minutes before, to just check in with people and see how people are doing. But try to use some kind of icebreaker. Okay, there's 2 bugaboos I have on agendas. I'd be curious in your outlooks on this. One is, word process isn't a great thing, but when I see an agenda that I can tell they just borrowed it from the last meeting and nothing's changed, I get bored, because I know it's just been recycled and it's all in the same order. I mean, at least change the order of the discussion. And then the second thing is, I have mixed emotions about durations on 10 minutes, 8 minutes. To me, that's a lot of structure. I mean, I get it, but if you've got a team where you've developed a working relationship, I always wondered about it. What are your thoughts on both things? One is recycling agendas, and then the second is putting durations on all the topics.
I don't recycle agendas. I try and make sure I've got new stuff, unless we've got something that's kind of, flowing over from the last month. I try and make sure we've got new stuff on every agenda, and I do not put durations on mine.
Okay. How do you control? Do you ever have trouble controlling durations of meetings?
No,
Right.
not so far.
Yeah, I don't, I tend to recycle PowerPoint decks because a lot of my stuff is event related. So the topics that need to be covered, sort of status updates in terms of project sections are typically pretty repetitive, but in terms of what the agenda is, it's not a formal document. It's usually just a Teams message or an email list of things. But I will say that I don't include times. I know people that do, you know, and I find it that it's people that are sort of new to managing meetings that do it. You know, they're not used to covering stuff. So they say, okay, we're going to talk about this for 10 minutes. I don't like to do it because I feel like it stifles the conversation. Like, I feel like if I say 10 minutes and it takes us 20 to work something out, then it takes 20 minutes. But, you know, I would be, but I am pretty good at landing at the end of the meeting though. So I do say, you know, if you say it's going to take us 20 minutes to get through this, I will stop and say, hey, we've got a lot to get through. We've got to move to the next thing. Can we table this and go talk about it afterwards with a smaller group, is the way that I handle that.
Yeah, and that's a great approach. And I think sometimes you need to practice doing that, because it's funny how awkward that can sound if you haven't at least practiced a little bit how to move it on, or you've got somebody who's filibustering like a Richard Pennington who's a lawyer, right? So, great comments. Do you use question marks on agendas? Something I always tell people, it just makes it sound like you're actually looking for ideas. If you put a question mark, just a tip, if you're really, you know, trying to get some idea creation. And then obviously, and this goes to Shannon's thing, at some point you got to figure out now who does what and when, you know, after this, because there's nothing more frustrating than have all these great ideas. You kind of know what the plan is, but nobody knows what it is they're supposed to do and the rest of that. So, so take a look at the John Cleese and just think about those few things. I'm going to give some very short summaries of some things that are happening now in teams that much of this didn't even make it in the book because it's more recently. Anybody know what VUCA is? It's a special kind of vegetable that we use in lunches, but it's actually comes out of the military. It's in the last couple of years now, and a lot of this has come out of special operations and leadership, but stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. Now, think about what you're going through right now and ask yourself, are we living in a world of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity? Yeah, I mean, we are. And what is happening is the Army uses the term commander's intent. It's forcing us now, when we have non-traditional kind of team relationships and communication styles, to do things like focus a lot more on communication strategies and really empower people. You can't do it all yourself. And if you were able to control everything that was happening in an office, you're probably losing the capability to do that. So you'll see this term. It's something that you're going to get thousands of hits on VUCA now, but if you're looking for ideas in terms of, I just don't know what to do. I mean, it's how do you rely on people? How do you rely on the team? What kind of conversations do you have with people to empower them? Give them the general guidelines or the guardrails within which they need to operate. Ask them to go do it. It's kind of like that SMART objective stuff we all learn, but the term is VUCA. I already mentioned groupthink, and a lot of people thought that maybe this would get solved a little bit because we're going to have all of these great virtual meetings and looking in people's eyes and being able to do more things efficiently in some ways. I know in teaching sometimes even it is, but what I think we're learning is it sort of aggravates, this environment aggravates groupthink. And then the question becomes, is it actually worse now? Groupthink means we're all going to just grab onto an idea that's been levied on us. Sounds pretty good without really challenging it at all. Yep, sounds good to us. Let's move forward. And some of those old techniques that you'll see out of Disney and some of the other companies that have said, you know, if I don't have anybody that is challenging the idea, we're not going to adopt it until we have a meeting when we get somebody to challenge the idea, there's got to be some competing thoughts. If you look on perch issues, I posted a great article to Fast Company on purchase issues on this issue about why in a virtual environment it's getting worse. Because there are oftentimes only two people that are doing all the talking. Others are just sitting back. They're kind of afraid to raise their hand virtually or turn off their mute. You're not seeing body language anymore, so it's hard to assess where people are. It is getting to be more challenging. And I take a look at that article, Fast Company. It's really well done and it's fairly short. I encountered a technique called cascaded messaging in a book. I'll show you the title to it here in just a minute by an author named Lencioni, who wrote The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. And sometimes groups get stuck and you're just and often at the decision-making point, you just don't know if you got enough data. You just don't know where you're going to go for decisions, because often the consequential decisions you try to do somewhat collaboratively, like evaluation committees. The cascaded message is a leader or a lateral leader saying, well, I know we can't agree on this, but we need to send an update up to my boss, whether that's deputy city manager, whether it's Rick Grimm, whether it's somebody, in an organization. And what can we at least put a message together to talks about where we are right now on the decision. And the idea is that if you can reach agreement on something that isn't going to have a lot of emotion, like just a status report, it gets a team moving forward, and they've shown that they can actually collaborate on something. It's called, it's a use of a term called cascaded messaging to do that. And we're going to just have a little kind of closing discussion now on engagement problems, because all of this is wonderful, but teams get dysfunctional, as Lencioni has taught us. And we saw this when I was at Nashville Value Point and dedicated an hour, I think, to this at one of the trainings on problems of engagement. And what happens when you're having, especially recurring ones by multiple people? What are the issues? I've got a couple bullets that I've used in the past that sort of framed the way I look at engagement problems in teams. And that is, first of all, reflect. If you're a leader or a lateral leader, what do they want out of this? These are the typical things. They want impact, the ability to contribute, some autonomy. They don't want to be, as Thea said, bossed around too much, right, Thea? And, some autonomy in terms of what they're doing, and then respect in terms of that their contributions acknowledged, their respect for their opinions. And how do you promote engagement? Well, you've had issues with this before in terms of when you felt like you just didn't want to go to those meetings anymore. I think what you try to do as a leader is sharpen a vision in your own mind of what full engagement looks like to you in the context of a project or a team project. And then you're trying to use facilitated methods and over time to kind of invite engagement by people and articulate your vision and ask people what they think. I mean, one of the great things, I think one of the best questions I ever heard once was after a meeting, we were all sort of thrashing around, not sure I was going to ever come again. Somebody in the back of the room said, how will we know we succeeded? Just a simple question like that. And that really prompted a great discussion back to what are we trying to achieve here? I mean, and get people thinking about that. So here's the little scenario I'd like to talk about. Now, what I've given you and I'm not going to have you read all of this. This actually was adapted, the bullets, from a training that the Leadership Development Council put together on dealing with conflict in committees. And so we were asking committee leads, committee chairpersons to take a look at an approach. I'd like to hear from you in terms of an approach that you might see in a committee where the first paragraph has happened. What's your approach to a discussion about that kind of conflict if you're in a small group environment? This is going to be one-on-one. This would be a one-on-one discussion likely. What resonated with me was the idea of sometimes you you have these assumptions. The one that Shannon gave was she thought somebody was disengaged, their head was down, blah, blah, blah. And they were working on something and she thought they were disengaged. And it turned out she had written down all these ideas to share with the group. And it's called mastering your own stories in terms of what you think is going on versus really what isn't. Sometimes you got to ask. Recognize that teams need people that lead at various stages. And these are I mentioned to the group initially when somebody asked me what are the key things that I would advise people as actionable ways to approach team membership, even if you're not the recognized leader, but you're helping the team. And the word help appears, I think, on every bullet. My thanks to Valerie for sharing your insight. And I hope that you've achieved the bar that I have for success, which is, did you learn anything you didn't know before? It was worth it.